For decades, we've had governors answering the public's call to spend more on public education in Illinois. We've known about these problems for years. We sought out 4 years ago to tackle these problems. Governor Rauner has touted himself the hundreds of millions of tax dollars that he has spent on public education. However, as we've gone through the language of his veto message, we've been troubled to discover that Governor Rauner looks to be lining up what can be described no less than an all-out assault on Illinois' commitment to public schools that appears to be designed over the long haul to reduce how much we spend on public education. With this veto, the governor has taken a hard right turn away from his previous positions on this matter. The veto will saddle yet another generation of Illinois school children with the least equitable system of public school funding in the country. Let me say that one more time. This veto will saddle yet another generation of Illinois kids with the least equitable system of public school funding in the country. Make no mistake, if we were to accept this amendatory veto as it was designed and issued at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, 10 years from now, we will be spending less on public education in the state of Illinois as a function of the law and as the veto provides. So I want to walk through 3 specific changes. There's more, and we can talk about those after I explain the severity of the 3 changes. And then following that, I'd be happy to take any questions or dive deeper into these issues. So for the first one, I'd point you to this chart right here. Schools are being punished for their efforts in their communities of economic development, job creation, and voter-initiated property tax caps. This week, after the governor's veto, school superintendents and mayors and local officials all over Illinois woke up to learn that they're being punished for their community's use of tax caps and aggressive economic development. Out of nowhere, Governor Rauner is pitting job creation efforts against school funding efforts throughout the state. He's gone so far as to accuse school districts of hiding property wealth. To borrow his words, don't you see how outrageous that is? The governor accusing school districts of hiding, that's the word he uses, hiding property wealth. Governor Rauner is creating a fight that nobody asked for and a fight that nobody wins. School superintendents, local mayors, and business development folks throughout the state are in an uproar over this change. I don't blame them. They should be. A governor simply does not seek this kind of policy change through an amendatory veto, particularly on a school funding reform bill during a school funding crisis. The next chart, declining enrollment. One of these days, I'm going to stop coming to this blue room and having press conferences about school funding because we're going to fix it. Years ago, we learned along the way that one of the reasons state lawmakers finally found success with Senate Bill 1 is that we were able to get away from the discussions about districts losing money in a formula change. We got lawmakers to start talking to each other and to understand what public education looks like in rural districts, in suburban districts, and in urban districts across the state. I said the other night in Gillespie at a town hall that was full of parents concerned about the plight of the Gillespie School District, not just in recent years, but in immediate weeks to come. I told those parents that about a year ago, I was on the south side of Chicago at Chavez Elementary, and I explained to the parents there that night that there are parents in places like Gillespie that care just as much about their kids' school as they do in Chicago. Well, last week in Gillespie, I said the same thing. And that night we had parents in Chicago watching that town hall over Facebook Live. And I explained to those parents in Gillespie that there are parents all over Illinois watching our conversation in Gillespie that care just as much about their kids' schools as they do. The result of those conversations was Senate Bill 1, which guarantees fairness for all school districts and ensures that no school district loses money. No school district loses money in Senate Bill 1. The idea of school districts losing money has always been a deal breaker for lawmakers during previous school funding debates. You all know that. The challenge of lawmakers to accept a policy change that results in school district losing money is a deal breaker. Now, along comes Governor Rauner's veto on Tuesday. His veto undid all of that work that we had accomplished. He seeks to punish schools for losing enrollment, a move probably designed to hurt the Chicago public school systems, which of course is his favorite target. But here's who loses, right here. All of those districts that are shaded in orange. The governor needs to try to get these lawmakers to vote to accept his amendatory veto. I don't know any lawmaker that would stand up on the floor of the House or the Senate that represents these areas of the state that would vote to accept this amendatory veto, because it will result directly in school districts that they represent, some of the most underfunded in the state, losing money. That's the result of Governor Rauner's veto. Lawmakers should be outraged by this. Superintendents should be outraged by this move. And most of all, parents who send their children to these schools should be outraged by this piece of the veto. Here's why we're doing this today. Our current system is a failure. Everybody knows that we have indicted the system over the last 4 years. We've explained why it's rotten. We explain why children that live in poverty are at the back of the line today in Illinois. This map shows underfunded school districts in the state of Illinois. Take a look at this and take a look at this, and you will see the impact of what Governor Rauner did on Tuesday. You can see visually that it's not good for underfunded school districts in Illinois. Our students, our teachers, our taxpayers are trapped within this broken system. We're as close to fixing this system as we ever have been. We are standing at the doorstep of historic change in Illinois. We sent a bill to the governor's desk, a bill that has withstood the test of time, the most scrutinized bill in state history, a bill that undoubtedly has broad agreement across the state of Illinois among parents, educators, superintendents, reform organizations. The list goes on and on of the supporters of Senate Bill 1. The act of sending the governor a bill on school funding reform, that act alone is an accomplishment. That hasn't happened in more than 20 years in Illinois. Governor Rauner discarded that work on Tuesday, and he not only discarded the work that we have done on Senate Bill 1, he used the mechanism of a veto to rewrite law so that school funding and school investment would be dialed down over the next several years. So much so, again, that 10 years from now, we will be spending less on public schools if we were to accept the governor's amendatory veto. Now, I want to talk about what I think the governor's real intent was with this veto. He has said, and I heard him yesterday at a couple of editorial boards say that he wanted to, quote, make it a better bill, end quote, make it a better bill. That's what I heard him say a couple times this week after the veto was issued. What he is doing, make no mistake, as evidenced by what we're showing you here today, from his veto language, is waging an all-out attack on public education in the state of Illinois. He's using the veto power of the executive branch to attack public education in the state of Illinois. Over time, the provisions outlined, and I will name these off if you want me to, the provisions outlined in Governor Rauner's veto would cause the state to divest from public education at historic levels and starve public schools. The first on the plate are the ones that are the darkest shade of orange. Consequently, the ones that are the darkest shade of orange in this chart are the ones that Senate Bill 1 helps first. Governor flips that, turns the table on underfunded school districts. At the very same time, it would be important to note that the governor is asking for more than a $100 million voucher program, one that is not funded, one that has not had a single public hearing to my knowledge in the General Assembly. But that's an ask that he has given of us, in order to continue discussions on Senate Bill 1 and a final compromise. So this is not about fixing Senate Bill 1. This is about doing what he wants to do, which is to divest from public education through the mechanism of an amendatory veto. Governor Rauner's veto language represents the opposite of his rhetoric, the opposite of the work that his own school funding commission performed, the opposite of his own talking points, the opposite of what he said yesterday. It goes against his boasts about donating to education causes, about ensuring the state appropriated record amounts of funding to schools. It goes against wanting to be our state's education governor, which we need desperately today, right now. Governor Rauner has sadly taken a hard turn to the right and abandoned all of his own policies and achievements to betray public schools in his amendatory veto, all within a matter of days. Here are the 7 things, and then I'll conclude and take your questions. Here are the 7 things in his amendatory veto that bend spending downward over time, that constrain investment in public education, using the forces of the law to constrain spending on public education. Number 1, the governor changes the regional cost differential in Senate Bill 1. He drives it down. Number 2, school districts that can't access property wealth because of the tax cap law. The governor doesn't recognize any longer. He would say we shouldn't recognize that those school districts can't access their wealth, so they appear wealthier than they actually are. Number 3, enrollment changes. The governor would exact pain on school districts that are losing enrollment. Our bill holds school districts harmless. No losers in Senate Bill 1. Number 4, the governor changes the minimum funding requirement in the bill. That is our guarantee that we're going to hold future General Assemblies and governors of both parties to this path toward equity and adequacy. That's the thing we put in the bill, in Senate Bill 1, that says we're going to continue to take steps in years to come until we get every school district to an adequate level of funding. Number 5, up here again, changes to how TIF districts are accounted for in the school funding formula. This pits job creation efforts against public school funding. That's opposite of what everybody wants to do. Those 2 things go hand in hand. The governor rips them apart, and he divides those 2 efforts that are happening all over the state, not just in one part of the state. Number 6, the governor removes language protecting and accounting for a potential pension cost shift. We put that in Senate Bill 1 because we thought it was a good piece of public policy today, given the fact that this debate continues. We wanted to make sure that if that ever changes in the future, that we would account for that in an adequacy target. The governor takes that out completely. And then finally, and this is probably most profound, I don't have a map of this one, but this one just completely guts the whole purpose of Senate Bill 1. The governor changes the adequacy calculation to not reflect actual costs in coming years. That's a big deal in Senate Bill 1. That's the most profound difference between Senate Bill 1 and the status quo today. We recognize that costs go up and down in school district based on many factors. The governor constrains that. And that, again, is to divest in future years from what it would take to get school districts to adequate and equitable levels of funding. And again, that guts the entire premise of Senate Bill 1. I want to go back to this one real quick. This is the most egregious. How many times have I been lectured? We've all been lectured about losers, winners and losers. We can't have losing school districts if we're going to get this done. That's a poison pill right there. I've heard many times from the governor himself, you've all written about it, the governor said over and over again, Manar's bill can't have losing school districts if it's going to pass. The governor wrote that into this bill with his amendatory veto. I can't imagine any legislator in downstate Illinois of either party would support this amendatory veto, because that will guarantee, not in year one, but beginning in out years, that will guarantee reductions on the part of the state funding formula to school districts that are losing enrollment. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and be happy to take any questions.
What you think going to do?
What am I going to do, Dave?
Yeah, what are you going to do?
So we had negotiating sessions today let's back up. Last Saturday, we began conversations with our Republican counterparts in the legislature to negotiate a reasonable compromise. We had a couple hours worth of a discussion today in an effort to try to identify a path toward a reasonable compromise. We are committed to that today. We will remain committed to that. But I'm here today to tell you that we are not going to accept this amendatory veto. This amendatory veto represents a hard right turn on the part of the Rauner administration in the last few days. It is unacceptable. It would not get us closer to equity. It does not fix the bill. So we are committed to seeing those conversations and those negotiations through. But sooner or later, we're going to have to make a decision about what to do with Senate Bill 1. Right now, the process is less important. What's more important is the outcome, and we're committed to seeing steps toward a reasonable compromise.
But if Republicans already know that you're compromising on a backup bill, why would they want to why would Republicans in the House, for instance, want to back an override motion when they could just sit and wait and see what your compromise would be?
Well, that's a good question. To me, the process is less important. You've heard me say this a couple times this week. I'm less committed to a process. I'm more committed to fixing that right there. That mess that plays out everywhere in the state of Illinois today. It's going to regurgitate itself in a few days when doors of schools are going to open, and there's going to be kids walking through a whole bunch of dark orange schools in Illinois, and we will have gone another year without fixing that mess right there. I'm less concerned about the process, Mark. I'm more concerned about fixing that mess. If that means a compromise bill, so be it. If that means an override plus a trailer bill, so be it. There's probably a dozen ways to do this. What I've told my Republican colleagues, I told Dr. Purvis this on the telephone yesterday. I'm less concerned about the process. I'm more concerned about that.
Is there anything in the AV that the governor got that could be a jumping off point for negotiations, or is this largely just something that you can't accept?
I don't believe there is. I don't believe there is. We are open to changes. This is no different than previous pieces of legislation that have gone through the Senate that didn't make it through the House. I'm always open to constructive criticism. As you know, this is a far cry from bills that I have filed and that the Senate has passed. This is very different. This already represents compromise. Senate Bill 1 does. But I don't see anything in this amendatory veto that even resembles anything that would get Illinois schools to be more adequately funded and certainly more equitably funded. There is nothing in this veto that I can point to today that is constructive in the conversation that Governor Rauner claims he wants to have. I, by the way, did not expect to say that. I thought that there would be some things in what Governor Rauner would put in a mandatory veto that could be used to help further discussions. But I think we've seen that the governor's not about uniting Illinois. He's pitting one part of Illinois against another. Kids here against kids here. There's nothing in this veto that I can point to that could be used in a constructive conversation.
So when you're having negotiations, are you talking about these things at all, or are you talking about entirely separate issues, including that $100 million scholarship tax credit?
So I'm going to put a little bit of definition around negotiations, but I'm not going to reveal details because I think that would be turning my back on those discussions, which I'm not going to do. We're talking about all kinds of things. What we have said to our Republican counterparts is let's have a conversation about what it's going to take to fix that. We think Senate Bill 1 should be the law of the state of Illinois. Despite the governor's actions on Tuesday, we still believe Senate Bill 1 should be the law. It's a good bill. It represents good public policy. What is it going to take to get you to a point to help us do that? We're hoping that some reasonable folks will step forward and will join in that conversation. That conversation is ongoing. So if there's something constructive that is reasonable, it's not going to be rejected by the Democrats.
What is the last time you had something you would define as a
today.
All, what was it, 8 people
Yes,
in person here? Or?
over the telephone.
Did any of them describe these cost escalators that Governor Rauner lined out in his AV in Senate Bill 1? What is their version of these cost escalators that they see that raises education costs over time?
Well, the governor's AV removes them, which is a cruel trick. That's a cruel trick. Because what it is doing, and what he is doing by removing factors in Senate Bill 1 like that one, is he is saying, you know, we're going to pay you, but we're not going to pay you what it really costs for you to do what we expect you to do and produce the result that we expect you to produce. It's much like that, you know, when politicians tout fully funding the foundation level, that's a foundation level based on costs of well over a decade ago. Senate Bill 1 is a dramatic change in public policy, but it accounts for the true costs of what we expect to be successful out of public education in Illinois. So when you rip those things out of a bill, not just that one, but any number of those things, you gut the bill. You gut the whole purpose of what the legislation is. So those things are what make up Senate Bill 1, what drives equity in the state, what accounts for costs. We hold every kid, every teacher in the state of Illinois is expected to produce the same result. Their kids take the same standardized tests. We have school districts spending $35,000 a student. We have school districts spending $6,000 a student. By the way, that gap's getting larger, not smaller. Senate Bill 1 will put us from last to first if we stick to the plan. That's why we believe Senate Bill 1 should be the law.
Senator, can I respond to the governor saying that this has been put off for 2 months because it's to put political pressure on those who are going to be asking for a vote to override or whatever the case may be? You know, why wait 2 months to make this happen if it was such a great bill and highly scrutinized?
You should pose the question to the governor, why did he wait until Friday to flip-flop about sending negotiators to the table? I would have been anywhere, on any day, at any time, for any length of time, to have a conversation about how to fix this. That happened in earnest for the first time on Saturday. That conversation on Saturday could have happened on June 1st. There were willing parties to come to the table. You can't negotiate with yourself, although some people like that on the other side of the aisle. That should have happened in June. I don't know why it took the governor 2 months to allow Republicans to have a conversation about school funding with their Democratic colleagues. That's a question you ought to pose to the governor.
Are Republicans going to have to split from the governor if there's going to be a deal?
So, you know, Monique, I've said many times that our preferred route here is not a veto showdown. That is not our preferred route. Our preferred route is fixing this problem with agreement, with bipartisan agreement. I still believe that's within reach. I don't believe the governor's veto on Tuesday helped that effort. I think the veto was designed to harm that effort. There's nothing in this veto that we can bring to the table that would help get us closer to equity. What we're entertaining is how do we reform a system with a bipartisan agreement that will actually lead to greater equity. There's nothing in the veto that does that.
Senator-
Therefore, it's not worth talking about.
So, is there any discussion going on about having a bridge funding bill that might
No.
bring you to
No.
6 months of funding? Would you,
No.
Would you go along with that so you could then be talking without having the schools at this point be put in harm's way?
There is no discussion, Terry. There's no discussion. I would just remind everyone, we are on the doorstep of historic reform. The House and the Senate sent the executive a bill to reform school funding. It's the first time that's happened in 20 years. If we don't capture this moment, if we don't capture this moment right now, then it will elude us for years to come. I can't imagine a situation right now where we would kick this can down the road. There's far too many people that have worked far too long on this issue, not just me. There's legislators who worked on this issue long before I ever got to the state Senate. Their work is the foundation of Senate Bill 1. We're not going to kick this can down the road. That's not going to continue. It is not going to continue. And if we kick the can down the road, that map for the next legislator whether that's me or anybody else that takes this on, is going to look a lot worse. That means the hole's going to get bigger before we get ourselves out of the hole. We have a moment. We sent the governor a bill for the first time in 20 years. Senate Bill 1 should be the law.
Senator, a couple of things, if you don't mind. Number one, the governor says ISBE hasn't done the numbers on his inventory.
Have you asked him why?
They expect that early next week.
So here's a question.
Well,
no-
my question is, where are you getting your numbers to say that Rauner's plan's gonna lose, or, you know, any of these charges?
You don't need numbers to know that that's going to make school districts lose. You just don't. The question that should be posed to the Rauner administration is if this mandatory veto that I presume was well-researched and well-crafted before it was issued, I mean, he had 2 months to do it, why didn't they hand you all a list of numbers at the same time they handed you a veto message? Why didn't they do that?
I think
Wh-
he told like an editorial board they were estimates, but he believes that they'll be close to whatever ISBE.
But there's no reason for estimates. There's no reason. There should be an exact dollar figure attached to that veto message. When the veto message was issued, he had 60 some odd days to put it together. 60 some odd days. I think that begs a lot of questions about what's going on with this amendatory veto. I further question, respectfully, my colleagues that rushed to the governor's defense on an amendatory veto that they haven't seen. I wonder what they think of this.
Well, and a couple other things on the list of 7 that you put out there, why should schools with decreasing enrollments keep the money that they've got coming in, or even get more money down the road?
Well, we talked for hours about this in the commission hearing, and it's a fact that just because a school district loses 1% of its students, excuse me, or 2% of its students, that doesn't mean that direct costs decrease. There's not a direct correlation between enrollment decline and expense decline. If there's a major enrollment decline, perhaps there would be. I would say in that instance there would be. But if there's a 1 or 2% slide, that's probably going to happen throughout a school district, not in second grade, right? There's not going to be so many second graders not enrolling that it affects 2% of a school district. So we've talked about this at the commission hearing, and we decided that no district should lose money until until we get the system fully funded. We should guarantee with certainty that school boards and administrators know exactly what they're going to get from the state of Illinois. Could you imagine a system where we could ensure school districts exactly what they're going to get? Also, enrollment figures are taken into account in the new formula. What we're talking about here is the hold harmless, right? New formula accounts for enrollment. So we would say it's accounted for appropriately in how new money is distributed. That's a good balance. That's a reasonable balance, again, that's embodied in Senate Bill 1 that the governor ripped out of it with his amendatory veto.
Senator, a question for TIFs,
Yep.
particular TIFs and PTELs. How far apart are you and Senator Barrickman on your ideals for how you'd like to see TIFs and PTELs handled in this?
Well, I'll tell you, when it comes to the PTEL issue, that's a brand new issue. The way the governor crafted his mandatory veto was with deliberate intent, I believe. Somebody has to know what they're doing to do what he did with that piece of the veto. That affects a very thin sliver of school districts, again, punishing them by recognizing or pretending that they're wealthier than the formula actually accounts for.
Without revealing negotiation specifics, how far apart are you and the GOP negotiators on this idea? Would you say there's a great deal of space between you two parties?
So I would say on the PTEL issue, because it's a brand new issue, there hasn't been a single public hearing or public discussion about what the governor put in his veto in regards to the PTEL changes. On the TIF issue, we've had public discussions. There's been many discussions. To Leader Radonio's credit, this is something that she filed, I believe, years ago. I believe that can be addressed. PTEL is a whole nother ball of wax.
Senator, I think we're talking about the wrong things. I can hear Governor Rauner walking into a corner cafe and saying Senate Bill 1 is a special deal for Chicago engineered by Mike Madigan. Who's in favor of that? And no hands go up. It's a compelling argument, and it's easy to remember. And I think that's what you're competing against, and how do you do that?
Well, of course it is. Just because the governor says it doesn't make it true. I think that was a statement by the Rockford Register-Star, I believe, in an editorial. I think they're right. Just because someone who carries the title of governor says something, that doesn't make it true. There is nothing in this bill, in Senate Bill 1, that affords the Chicago public school system something that everyone else isn't already entitled to. There is nothing in Senate Bill 1 that entitles the Chicago public school system to anything that everyone else isn't already entitled to. That's a fact. I would also point you to the amendatory veto, the so-called bailout that the governor's been talking about all over downstate Illinois. You know, the governor, this is more trickery in the veto. The governor removes the $221 million for normal costs, and he puts it right back. That's not vetoing out the bailout that he claims exists in Senate Bill 1. When he says I removed it, he's somewhat correct, but he doesn't say he puts it right back. So that's trickery, and that's what I mean. That's political rhetoric, Dave. Political rhetoric doesn't fix this problem. Reasonable compromise will fix this problem.
I think